qui a Trento con il professore Branko Milanovic, è un esperto di disuguaglianze. In particolare il suo lavoro riguarda la scomposizione del livello della disuguaglianza da diversi punti di vista, a livello nazionale, tra le nazioni e a livello globale. Gli faremo una breve intervista. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Okay, first of all, considering the middle class shrinking problem, as we saw during the conference, the middle class is decreasing in the developed countries.
Right.
What could be a policy to help it? For example, if we consider the welfare state, we actually see that right now the trend is against increasing the welfare state. For example, if we consider Trump in the USA. And on the other side, considering education, can that be like a solution? Because, for example, if we say that there are more jobs in the low part of the distribution and in the highest part, maybe education can help meritocracy, but can it shrink the lower side of the distribution?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's of course a difficult problem because, as you said, actually the middle class in the rich countries is shrinking. At the same time, the middle class in poorer countries and the world is expanding. So there are really these two phenomena at the same time, which are apparently different. What can be done? I know that everybody always says education, education, and I'm obviously very much in favor of education. But one has to realize that the effect of education on a country, for example, like Italy, between 1945 and 1990 was absolutely dramatic and important because the average age of education probably was about 5 or 6 years after the World War II, and then increased to 13, 14. Education cannot play the same role in the future of that kind, just simply because we have a limit of the number of years of education. We cannot go to 25 years. But what is important is obviously quality, but more important than that is access to equal quality of schools. And that's where the issue, which now is becoming also a European issue, of private schooling becomes very important. Because what is happening, obviously, when the rich people are able to essentially pay very high tuition fees for their children, now they go to schools which are either better or maybe claim to be better, but in any case they are then able to get higher wages. So I think that education the objective should be an improvement of quality of public education so that the public education can play the role that it played in the past.
Okay, perfect. And then the second major problem is the fact of the share of capital and share of labor. That the relationship is changing and the share of capital is gaining more with respect to the share of labor. And it goes together with, for example, the fact that it's harder to tax capital that can move more internationally. And a solution to that could be, for example, an international cooperation, but it doesn't seem again to be the way we're taking. And there could be any other kind of cooperation, for example, of the labor class cooperation international level, or what kind of cooperation could help to lower this problem?
I actually think that what you said is really the international cooperation. Now, the international cooperation can help, and I think it will happen, because help in taxation, in evasion of taxes, because evasion of taxes has really become now a major problem for large countries like France and Germany. I think we're talking about $200 billion that are being evaded annually. So it's really a big problem. And when big countries decide that they actually are losing lots of money, I think they will be able to crack down on that. So that's for tax evasion. But other issues are more difficult to tackle. For example, mobility of capital, which is different from tax evasion. You have, of course, mobility of capital makes tax evasion simpler, but there is also mobility of capital, which is legitimate. You hire workers in different countries, like, as you know, German companies move to Slovakia. There was recently a case of a company, American company in Italy moving to Slovakia, for example. That's, of course, much more difficult, and that's something that I think in principle should not be dealt with, because it is really free mobility of capital and ideally also of labor. So these are the different things. So one might want to actually increase tax rates, as we were talking before, on wealth globally. Inheritance tax, I believe, also. But I agree with you that it is difficult to actually stop legitimate movements of capital, because the question then becomes, why should somebody employ the same person for, let's suppose, 2,000 euro per month if he can actually get the same job done by somebody for 800 euro a month. So I think these are legitimate moves.
Okay, well, when talking about the developing countries instead, you say that the shrinking in the middle class in the developed country is actually helping the middle classes in the developing country. But still the inequalities are going to the same, are converging, but are not decreasing globally. So is there gonna ever be a moment where the income inequality decreases both in the developing countries and in developed countries, or that's not going to be the trend?
Well, I don't see this as being a trend, but let me just say what you said before. It's not that that the middle class in rich countries has decided, okay, we want to help people in China, so we are going to shrink. It's not how it happened. What happened is that actually China and India and Burma and so on, by growing, are producing goods which are similar to the goods that used to be produced by the middle class here. So the shrinkage of the middle class comes as the result of competition, or the fact that actually you can move capital now and employ people in Indonesia rather than employing them in Italy. So it's not a conscious decision. And I just put it in terms of the, how should I say, to some extent, uneven distribution of benefits from globalization. You know, it is that some got more benefits, others less. But that's something which technically you can always expect with large movements like globalization. You cannot expect everybody to benefit. And that's not the reason for globalization to be abandoned. I think it's actually, as I was saying before, it's the reason for the country governments that have people who have been affected to be more sort of efficient in helping them. Although I'm agreeing with you, it's not an easy thing to do because you're limited by what you can do essentially by globalization. As we were saying before, you cannot really tax somebody. Nobody in the middle class nowadays in Italy is going to pay a tax rate of 90% on the marginal income. You know, that's absolutely impossible, I think, politically to implement.
No, definitely. And okay, so to conclude, at this point, for example, right now in Italy there is a lot of public speech about helping the people, while actually on the other side the policies that are proposed seem to be on the opposite way. For example, the flat tax that should help this middle class that is not probably going to do it, or the universal basic income that is only a word that is used for another kind of policy. There is some connection with the level of inequality and maybe the fact that the people then are following some politicians that propose them something that should help them, but actually is not going in this direction?
Well, you know, it's very difficult now to say. As you know, the political situation in Italy is very fluid, so we don't know what first how the new government would function, what would be the policies, and you know that better than I. There are many contradictory parts. But let me just say something about the flat tax. As I said before, I'm against the flat tax because I think the taxes should be progressive, not proportional. But the rationale that some people give for flat tax is they say if we have a flat tax, let's suppose, I don't know what is the rate in Italy, which is about 15%, is oftentimes they say. For example, that's the rate which exists in Hungary. They say that in Italy that would actually reduce tax evasion because they say then in that case the rich people would also pay, so maybe the income from taxation would be higher. And I see the logic of that argument, but I think that the same results could be sort of reached by still having progressivity. You might want to have, I don't know, you might have to have a tax which would be 10 and then 15 and 25 and then maybe 40 or something, but you can still have different ranges and you can be progressive and you can actually improve ability to limit the tax evasion. So I'm not sure that actually by introducing flat tax you would really have elimination of the tax evasion and increase in the fiscal revenues. And even if you had that, you still have to put on the other side the fact that it is really a tax that doesn't help the poor and the middle class. So even if this were to the case.
Okay, perfect. Okay, very last question.
Yes, okay.
Okay, I wanted to ask you something else, that it's about the theories of Paul Krugman, that like the new economic geography. And for example, it is kind of another dimension of the way the world works. So, for example, within the same state, what happens with globalization or technological change, different regions have different levels of inequality.
Right.
So, for example, in Italy, or like in some states where the luckiest part of the state has inequality that is becoming lower, while other parts of the states have inequality that is becoming higher because of the aggregation theories.
But inequality or income?
Income, but also
Yeah,
there are some researchers that say also inequality that change
Yeah.
patterns.
So what is the question then?
So what do you think about this other measure of inequality, like this other level of study of inequality?
Well, I don't have some particular view on that because actually for me the unit, as you have seen, the unit of analysis is actually, let's call it percentile or decile within each country.
Yes.
So that percentile or decile can come from different parts of the country. Now, Italy, which has, of course, these large differences between north and south, is probably the case that large percentage of people who are at the lower income levels comes from the south.
Yes.
But I don't deal with that in what I do.
Level.
And actually, it is yet a possibility. Actually, we do have now data that would disaggregate whatever I've shown you here. That would disaggregate further. Let's suppose what is generally called like the second level of administrative units, which would be in a province in Italy, for example.
Yes.
So you could do that, and of course, many people have done that for countries like Spain or Germany or the UK and so on. But it doesn't come into my study.
Okay.
So that's something for the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.